Hi everyone, welcome back to the class, and now in this series of videos we're going to be continuing on, we're leaving Plato behind, we're now moving into Aristotle. And with that, there's a few things I should tell you right up front. First of all, Aristotle is very dense and difficult, and I think that's to be expected, but because it's difficult, we're going to have to take things in a slightly different direction. In some ways, we could begin just about anywhere to talk about his philosophy. And what we're going to do here is we're going to start with his theory of knowledge. Now, in introductory courses, we don't always talk about Aristotle's theory of knowledge, but as it happens, I wrote my dissertation on it. It's something I know pretty well, and I think it's interesting. And it's going to provide us with a way of contrasting Plato with Aristotle. Since we already know our Plato, we have some concepts that we can use to understand what Aristotle's doing. Let me say a little bit more about Plato before we go on back to Aristotle. Now, as we saw with Plato, we have this theory of recollection which says that we get to know everything that we know in reality, we know because we've known it before. And the idea was we were supposed to know things because it's disembodied, or my soul existed in a different place where it could behold the forms and it retained all that knowledge, and then I was born again back into this body. And so in a way, when I know things, I am remembering them, or I'm recollecting them from the past. Now, what Aristotle is going to do here is he's going to get rid of this picture. We're no longer going to have a recollection picture. And instead what we're going to do is we're going to replace that view with a theory that does not depend on knowing things beyond our lives in this physical world. So, in some sense, Aristotle wants to do some of the same things. He wants to explain how we know concepts and how we know things about the world. In fact, he's going to say that there is a way in which we can know forms, but those forms do not exist beyond this physical world. And that's very important. So we're going to get some of the same features, but without appealing to anything beyond where we are now. Let's see how it works. Now, one big difference between Plato and Aristotle right up front, you'll recall that in the Meno, when Socrates is questioning Meno, he will say things like, well, I want a definition of virtue, and the definition of virtue should be just one definition for one thing, right? He thinks it's a category like health or strength. Now, when it comes to knowledge for Aristotle, Aristotle actually thinks that when we're trying to give an account of knowledge, it's not going to be just one thing. And in fact, there's going to be 5 different kinds of thing. We find this in a book by Aristotle called Nicomachean Ethics. And here are the 5 kinds. He calls one of them theoretical knowledge. In Greek, this is episteme. We have another thing called practical wisdom. That's a thing called phronesis. You might think of that as knowing how to do knowing how to live. A third kind called techne. This is how to make things. A fourth thing called philosophic wisdom. That's Sophia. And then finally, a thing called intuitive reason, or nous. Now, these are very different from each other. For our purposes here, we're going to be focusing on episteme, the first kind, and then also the 5th kind. The other 3 we're going to leave aside for now. Now, earlier when we were talking about Plato, I gave you a kind of skeleton key or recipe for reading Socratic dialogues. I'm going to say that I have a kind of, if you like, skeleton key or recipe for Aristotle's works as well, and I'm going to reveal that in pieces as we go. I'll give you the first 2 parts of it, though, in this video. To do that, I want to talk about a couple texts. First of all, in the Metaphysics, Aristotle says, all men by nature desire to know. An indication of this is the delight that we take in our senses, for even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves, and above all others, the sense of sight. Now, at the beginning of the Physics, Aristotle says, when the objects of an inquiry in any department have principles, conditions, or elements, it is through acquaintance with these that knowledge, that is to say, scientific knowledge, is attained. For we do not think that we know a thing until we are acquainted with its primary conditions or first principles. We have carried our analysis as far as its simplest elements. So he says our first thing that we have to do here is find what relates to the first principles. Now Aristotle continues and he says, the natural way of doing this is to start from the things which are more knowable and obvious to us, and proceed toward those things which are clearer and more knowable by nature. For those things are not knowable relatively to us, and knowable without qualification. And then Aristotle gives this really interesting example at the end. He says, what is plain and obvious to us at first is rather confused masses, the elements and principles of which become known to us later by analysis. Thus we must advance from generalities to particulars. And the example he gives is of a young child, and this is kind of a crude example, but I think it's instructive. The young child, he says, begins by calling all men father and all men mother, but later on distinguishes each of them. Now, from the two texts we've seen so far, I want to draw some conclusions, and I'm going to make 2 points here. One, Aristotle believes that all human beings are naturally curious. We simply desire to know about the world. And I think today Aristotle would probably like very much the podcasts that we have around us, or channels like National Geographic, or the mysteries that we get interested in solving. Those to him, I think, would just be indications of our desire to know things about the world. However, though, Aristotle says once our curiosity is stimulated about something, once we want to find out, we need a way of investigating the things that we're curious about. We have to start somewhere, and so where do you begin? And I think what Aristotle's going to say is where we begin is with what's around us. And I think for Aristotle, this is going to be, I think for him, very much a common sense orientation. You got to start somewhere, so you start with things in your neighborhood, in your family, in your life. You begin searching there. Now, it's important to note, though, in the passage we just looked at, that while we may begin our investigation at a certain point, and it may look a certain way, once we've conducted the investigation, it may look differently to us. And that's important. The things we understand transform as we investigate them. So I'm going to say for us, that's probably going to be the first 2 pieces of our skeleton key or recipe. Human beings are naturally curious. We need a place to start, so we start with what's near us. We're going to see the rest of those pieces as we go. In the next video, I want to talk a little bit about these things that he calls first principles. So what they are, and a bit about how they get acquired. See you then. Thank you for watching.